We're going to go back a bit in American history, but perhaps not back as far as it might seem. Point of departure is this book called Ring by Jonathan Yardley, who's book editor of the Miami Herald and whose column you read every Sunday. And I guess basically that page is yours to do with as you please.
Yes, for better or worse, Joe.
No, it's always very good.
Thank you.
Ring Lardner. I guess I would ask you why a biography. He died in 1933.
Right.
What's significant
Well,
about today?
he was, from a purely personal point of view, there are a lot of reasons why I was interested. I love baseball. When I was a boy 25 years ago, I loved Ring Lardner, read You Know Me, Al, and the famous stories. He's the quintessential American literary success story, early success, huge success. At one point, his earnings were the equivalent of $500,000 a year from writing alone in today's dollars. And then declined through alcoholism, and it's the whole syndrome that we've seen repeated over and over in American literary stories. And he had an enormous influence on the way other writers came to write the American language. Hemingway was heavily influenced by Lardner. More even than Mark Twain, Lardner was the first person to write the American language the way we speak it. And so even though a lot of his own work is no longer widely read, his influence continues, and that, I think, is the principal reason why he's worth doing. He also led an interesting life.
But you know, it always concerns me that it seems only writers or people interested in writers, which is a small portion of our population,
Right, unfortunately.
really takes the time to analyze why things like this are important. Now, you and I believe they are, but too many people, I think, just don't even think about it, that so Ring Lardner could write well, or so Hemingway could write well. So what? Well,
Ring Lardner, in the last 2 decades of his life, told us a great deal about the kind of people we are. He didn't write, although he was an aristocrat himself, the world he wrote about was the America of the baseball clubhouse, the chorus line, the bridge table, the Pullman car. He was the first American writer to describe the way fairly ordinary Americans lived, worked, talked, and at the time he was the most popular writer in the United States, and he was a celebrity in the way that a major television figure is today. His newspaper column, written once a week, was syndicated to papers with a total circulation of 8 million, which is the equivalent today of, what, 20 million. And,
but even had a larger impact because of there was not television to compete. And
precisely, and radio was just beginning. Yeah. As a matter of fact, in the last year and a half of his life, he did the first serious radio criticism that had ever been done. He wrote a radio, he was very ill, and he had to stay in bed, and he listened to the radio and wrote a column for the New Yorker. First serious broadcast criticism.
Baseball, but more broadly sports, seems to have spawned so many good writers.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, I'd back up on you, Joe, a little bit and say that baseball, interestingly enough, has really spawned the only first-rate sports fiction that we have in this country. Ring Lardner's You Know Me, Al, letters written in the vernacular, was the first. It's not a novel, but it can be read as one, interrelated stories, and it's the first real baseball novel, and it's been followed by Mark Harris's Bang the Drum Slowly, Bernard Malamud's The Natural, Robert Coover's Universal Baseball Association. I think there have been football novels, and there have been a couple that came close, notably Joiner by James Whitehead and End Zone by Don DeLillo. But baseball is so much in the American grain. It's a country game played in the city. It's a game played mostly by country boys, but it attracts Americans in ways that no other game does. And one of the wonderful things, I've been watching it with just an enormous amount of pleasure, is this year has been the best baseball year in a long, long time, and Ring Lardner's 2 old teams, the first 2 teams he covered, the Chicago White Sox and the Chicago Cubs, are incredibly and improbably right up there in the thick of it, and the whole country is caught up in baseball enthusiasm now the way it used to be when Ring was a young reporter, and it was the only game in the country. And it's a wonderful thing for me. I have obviously some mixed
Sure.
mixed motives about it, but I just think it's great to see baseball fever alive again.
Let's talk about Ring again some more. He, like so many other literary figures of that period, of the 20s, of course, which I guess was one of the great watersheds of
Right.
literary criticism and writing and journalism, was a troubled man.
Right.
His close friend, neighbor in Long Island, F. Scott Fitzgerald, troubled too.
Right.
Why?
Well,
Why so many troubled
that's
people?
one of the questions I obviously tried to answer. In Lardner's case, it's really too complicated to give a 30-second answer.
Right.
I think that Ring was torn himself between a desire to have fun out of life and a feeling that he ought to be doing more serious work than he actually did. He did wonderful work, but it's very limited work. He never, for example, wrote a novel, although he had huge pressure from Fitzgerald and Maxwell Perkins and others who admired his talent, Henry Mencken, to write a novel. He never did it. I think that he felt, and I think he's right, that he didn't need to write a novel in order to have had a worthy, honorable career. But I think there's a contradiction in Ring's personality between what he wanted to do and what he felt he ought to do that troubled him. And I think that finally, when he reached the point where he was writing just to make money, he realized that he was never going to be more than he was. What he was good, but I think that finally drove him into the final stages of alcoholism, and he was, in the last months of his life, was a despairing man. But let me add to that, he was also a very courageous man who could have succumbed to disease, could have become embittered, but he never was. He kept his family and his readers laughing right to the end.
So it was a calling, certainly, to him to do what he was doing.
It was an
more than just a job.
accidental calling. He was a wealthy. He came from a wealthy family in Michigan, and he had no formal education beyond high school, and he seemed to be all set to be a drifter when he drifted into a newspaper office in South Bend, Indiana, and began writing baseball. And suddenly he discovered ambition. He really just happened onto a career. It just happened that he was one of those lucky people who falls into exactly where he should be.
I wonder, you being an author yourself, but you also are an author of authors by your position with the
Right.
Herald. Do you ever find it difficult to keep your head in perspective? I mean, you can be very king-like on that page and what you review and what you don't.
Well, I'll tell you,
Criticism.
I am just beginning. I'm just in the early stages of being reviewed myself. I'm on the other side of the fence for the first time, and it's a very strange sensation, and indeed a sobering experience. I have, though, Joe, after going through a few reviews and having some early reviews of my book and having some high moments and some low ones, and it's tended to make me a lot more cautious about being severely negative. But on the other hand, I've gotten as far as I have professionally by being honest, and I know now what it's like to have my own feelings hurt and to be raised high and on my feet.
Well, it's like we do in shows in television, and the people see what they see on the screen. It does no good to say, well, here's why we failed
Right.
because we couldn't do this. They don't care, and
Right.
they shouldn't.
Right.
Nor should a critic try to make excuses for a product. I think an artistic product must stand on its own
Right.
merits.
Right. Well, I'll certainly stand by my book, and I think I'm aware of the things that may be wrong with it as well as the things that are good about it. But it's really like sending a new baby into the world.
Yes.
And I must say that having done book reviewing for 12 years professionally, and it's an extraordinary sensation suddenly to realize what all those people out there who've been waiting for the reviews to come in, how they felt.
That's right. Well, Jonathan Yardley of the Herald, we'll look forward to seeing what other people are going to say about it, but meantime, this is what it looks like, and that's the title, Ring, by Jonathan Yardley. And you can still see him every Sunday in the Herald, and we thank you very much for
I
being
thank
with us.
you, Joe.
We'll be right back.